Up to order. It is Tuesday, October 27th, 2020, and this is the Superintendent Workshop, and it's 1 p.m. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Moore for a series of presentations.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We do have 3 presentations today. The first 2 will be led by our district's Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Fagan, in which we'll be discussing our financial statements for the month ending August 31st, as well as our surplus property, 2 items that typically go before the board. And then Mr. Bass will lead the board in some dialogue, conversation, and feedback regarding our legislative priorities for the upcoming session. So with that, if you're all right, Madam Chair, we'll turn it over to Mr. Fagan.
Through the chair. Through the chair, thank you, Sue. The first item is the regular declaration of surplus property. The majority of the items on this month's agenda are surplus radios. If you recall, a few months ago, we had an action item to replace the radios in the district. A certain number of those radios were part of the trade-in, and you were able to get offset that cost with some trade-ins. We had more radios than that were allowed, so the rest of these radios will be surplused and sold on Gov Deals. The line items, 28 of the 31 items are radios. Any questions? Okay. Next item is the financial statements for the month. Let me get over to my page. These were for the period ending August 31st. A couple of high notes. One is cash and cash investments. As far as August 31st, we had $48 million in cash. $35 million is what I call liquid cash. Approximately $13 million is for your debt service. It's for a sinking fund requirement to pay a bond off in the future years. So basically, your $35 is your net cash. Today, you have approximately $37 million in total cash, $24 million net cash, as compared to $35 a month ago. It is expected that we'll be fine throughout the rest of this month, with an anticipation of $50 million coming from the county in November. We have already received $2.1 million from the county. They advanced us early, gave it to us the latter part of about 2 weeks ago. We may get another allocation before then next week, but probably not. As far as the financial goes, general fund is typical for this time of year. Revenues are a little bit lower, simply the timing of the collections, and of course our expenditures are slightly up 1%, $300,000, primarily due to an increase in salaries and benefits and increase in COVID. Your fund balance budgeted is still at your 5%, $7.7 million. Your actual fund balance is approximately 6.4. This is just the timing of when the cash comes in actually from the county, and we book it. In 30 days, you'll have a fund balance of probably $60 million. So it's just the timing of when the cash actually comes in. All your other funds are trending appropriately. Capital funds, collections are slightly higher due to receivables, and expenditures are slightly down because the delay of summer projects over the summer were delayed, and therefore they'll be picking up this year. Food service, your revenues are approximately a little bit lower simply because of the grab-and-go meals, but also your expenditures are down approximately $200,000. Special revenue, your federal is trending with about 20% more in revenues. That's primarily because of your CARES money. And of course, your expenditures are up because you're spending the CARES money, so it's trending accordingly. Group insurance is in very good shape. Revenues are slightly down simply because of the pharmacy rebates have not been processed by the rebate companies yet. But also your expenditures are slightly higher than the prior year, $600,000, simply due to the additional prescription claims. But overall, your fund balance is $6.3 million, which is $1.7 million more than the prior year. Any questions?
Dr. Schiff, do you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick question. You mentioned that the county advanced us some money and will advance us more.
Through the chair, normally we do not get our first property taxes until November. They simply looked at the prior history and just kind of forward funded us about $2.1 million.
Yeah, so exactly. So that was my question. Because of when we get those, and because there's always this period right about now where we get into a little trouble. Was that a new thing that happened, and does that help us avoid that gap when we typically get property taxes? And is that something we haven't done in the past and can continue doing in the future, or what was different about this year, if anything?
Through the chair, yes, ma'am, it is new this year and it was started last year. Prior to that, it had not been done. And yes, it definitely helps us as far as the cash flow.
And is that the thing that would, if done ongoingly, helps us avoid going out for TANs at the last minute, rather than TANs to help us better balance our resources, but TANs that we've had to do in the past at the last minute to make that budget shortfall when we work with the county like this, then that helps us avoid that. Is that right?
Through the chair, yes, ma'am. This enables us to further safeguard ourselves, avoid having to issue a TAN, and approximately saves the district somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000.
Right. And as I recall, you said at a prior meeting, we do not anticipate that happening at all this year, correct?
No, ma'am.
Thank you.
Mrs. Justice?
Yeah, I just want to clarify, when we say county, we actually mean tax collector's office. That's not Jason Brown and the county commissioners.
Through the chair, yes, ma'am.
Yes, so have we thanked Carol Jean Jordan and the tax collector's office for advancing us that money?
Absolutely, and yes, ma'am, I have a planned visit to go see them.
Wonderful, great. And it would be nice if we could maybe acknowledge that at a board meeting, I think, because this has been a significant problem, and their help in this really does make a difference. You spoke a little bit about our capital fund and some delays in projects. I have a little knowledge about construction, so I'm just curious what caused the delays.
Through the chair, the best of my information is simply due to COVID. Certain vendors and certain projects could not be started over the summer, and therefore that delayed their implementation.
So as a board member, I recognize, I'm asking some questions that I may not, I can get the answers in the next, 2 weeks, but, that's something to me that I think I would definitely pay attention to, I'm not aware of a lot of construction-related delays in other areas in the county. And so that would make me wonder why we were feeling it. So I'd probably want some specifics about that, only because with some of the safety issues and things that we were addressing with our capital fund and some of those improvements, I'd want to know why there were delays. And I just think it's kind of an important thing to know. That is it for now, Mrs. Rourke. Thank you.
To the chair, yes, ma'am, I'll get that information.
Mrs. Barrenborn?
Yes, thank you for bringing up the fact that the tax collector's office did that, and they were kind enough to do that last year, so I thank you to Carol Jean Jordan. So we are safe in no TAN this year. However, even with the tax collector's office sending us that, next year, would that be enough to be able to cover us without having to go out to TAN?
We'll look at the numbers as we get through this year and do a projection, but my anticipation would be yes.
It would be yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Always subject to change, though.
Okay. Because you mentioned that because of construction delays that we had that extra funding. So
Delayed, it was basically an overall look at cash management and cash flow, implementing some new procedures. If we get into a spending bonanza toward the end of the year, which therefore affects your ending cash flow, therefore that would put a damper on the ability to avoid a TAN next year. It all flows in cycles. You spend more this year, you end with less, you start with less.
right, and so that's something to consider when we're looking at our legislative priorities.
To the chair, yes,
All
ma'am.
right, thank you.
Any other comment, questions? Just for clarity, even though that those dollars were pulled, the cash was pulled from the capital, because we took it from capital, it doesn't mean that even if we spend it in curriculum or somewhere else that, or let's say for staff, because that's not a capital, that doesn't mean that those capital projects will not get done because we spent the money that we pulled out to cover ourselves
Through the chair,
during
no,
this
ma'am.
time.
Has no impact on that.
Exactly. Okay. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Fagan, for your detailed report. And now we're moving on to legislative priorities. And just to set this up before I turn it over to Mr. Bass for an introduction to facilitate the conversation, what we did during our last workshop was have the opportunity to listen to board members speak through legislative priorities. We were able to capture some of those thoughts and create what you see before you now. And speaking with some of you leading up to this meeting, I know there's some opportunities to enhance or slightly tweak some of these, but this is the opportunity to have that conversation obviously in the sunshine. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Bass.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Good afternoon. Like Dr. Moore said, I think he introduced it pretty well, so there's not a whole lot more I can say to that. But taking your comments, your suggestions at the workshop, 2 workshops ago, kind of merging those with some of the items that we had already put down. This is our working document now that we have before you. As Dr. Moore said, I guess the opportunity here to amend, change, delete, add would be now. So, Ms. Zork, I don't know do we want to go through this item by item, or do we want to just discuss it in general?
Can I ask, if board members don't mind, I do have a question. I was a legislative liaison for 3 years on the board, and prior to me coming on the board, the legislative platform has always been the board's legislative platform. I'm concerned here when I look at this that there is a reason that the board is responsible for this legislative platform, because that is what we do. We legislate, and we have those connections and contacts with our other elected officials, and not to even have this represent the board, I do have some concerns with this, just looking at it that way, because whoever the board decides the next legislative liaison, and the entire board's responsible for this. But when I look at this, this looks like the superintendent's legislative platform. So that's my concerns with this, board members, and I think it's a slippery slope that you need to consider in handing over this responsibility to the superintendent, whenever it should be all of ours who have been elected to do this.
And to that point, I think you bring up a good point, and I think, I wanted to discuss a little bit the way that the legislative liaison piece has worked. But Dr. Moore, hi, you have a fairly good-sized staff now supporting you within the district office. When I've worked with other districts through the Central Florida School Board Coalition or through FSBA, other districts have some legislative help for their board members and their staff, and that seems to be an area where this school district, and you and I have had conversations before, operated somewhat in a bubble or in a silo, not really communicating with other districts very much, not communicating with other superintendents very much, and I know that's changing now. So perhaps there could be a staff member that was a point person for legislative things coming up, and I know you kind of disperse it amongst Mr. Fagan for some of the financial things, and perhaps Mr. Bass, but I see the superintendent and staff's role in that capacity, and then the board members crafting the legislative platform, like Mrs. Zork is saying. As far as a legislative liaison is concerned, I think it is true, Mrs. Zork, that it is the entire board's responsibility. Mrs. Berenborg did a very good job trying to keep us updated, but honestly, you are a board member, you are not a legislative secretary gathering that information, and I don't know that that was the best use of anyone's time as a board member, considering what our real role is supposed to be. So I don't know if perhaps, I know in working with Rutledge Asenia or some of the other groups, perhaps a more professional approach in working with a group that could give more recommendations to the school board about what's going on and projections about what's happening. So all board members have the same information for conversations as well. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up was, Mrs. Berenborg, you are married to someone that works for one of our representatives, and while when we originally appointed you as legislative liaison, I didn't see that as a conflict. I have actually experienced several times where it has been a conflict in communication with our representative. So that's been interesting in dealing with sometimes, and because we operate in the sunshine and we can't have private conversations, it becomes difficult to navigate through. So just a thought to that in sharing the responsibility of being an advocate for your board and legislative issues. Do you have any thoughts, Dr. Moore, about the role of a group like Rutledge or any other group for that matter, or FADS and some of the projections they do, or FSBA, and maybe working with the board a little bit more in that way?
So through the chair, absolutely, and I agree wholeheartedly. I think this is an opportunity to really facilitate the conversation with board members to create what is their collective priorities. And by no way am I trying to craft the legislative priorities for the district, but facilitate the conversation. I think if you read through these, you'll actually see it summarizes the conversation of the board. I do think staff can do a better job of facilitating and supporting the work and making connections moving forward, which is a streamlined approach. I agree. We are organized in a way now where Mr. Bass can lead a lot of this work and pull on staff or certain areas of expertise. So I think as we begin to really move forward and get beyond COVID and to get to the important work that we are all here to do, this process becomes much more streamlined and efficient.
And hopefully less reactive. I think this board has had a more reactive approach, and I think Mrs. Berenborg, you would bring us information, but a lot of times we were kind of struggling to get on top of it, right? There were things that were happening currently. Were we missing it? Were we not missing it? Obviously not being as connected as you were. So I do think there's a place for staff to help to work with board members so that we can be more effective in our role as legislators and policymakers. I have one last comment about this, if I may. May I? Increase the distribution of FEFP funding. So would it be increase the frequency of the distribution, or the, I'm talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, increase the distribution of FEFP funding to districts if districts' total state funding is less than 50%. Could we be a little bit more, we'd like to have, we're not, I mean, it's, of course, if they want to give you more money, you'll take it. But what I mean is to increase it in frequency, or in rather than, or do you understand what I'm saying? To be a little bit more, I don't know how you would word it, but.
Right, through the chair, the more specific toward this is where it would, how they would allocate. Mr. Fagan, I know had kind of worked with me on this one. Do you, language, I mean, we can come up with something that would pinpoint it better.
Do you understand what I'm saying about that?
So through the chair, you're talking, this language used to be language that was several years ago, like 2000, maybe 11 or 1, I can't remember exactly. But basically what we're doing is asking the state to just forward fund us a little bit earlier. Not any more money, just don't do it in your normal frequency. If most of my money comes local, give me 25% of it by August. So you're gonna give them the same amount of money, you're just gonna give it to me earlier.
So could we maybe shorten that and just say that?
Well, you have to be specific to the state when you tell them what calculation you want to use the money, or else
Sure.
they will carve out class size, they'll carve out pieces and give you less of what they think the calculation is.
Right, I can understand that.
We
concern
can,
as
but then when
well.
it gets to DOE, how they interpret it is how they'll determine how the funding will be. So I was just trying to be as explicit as possible,
Sure.
so the folks at DOE would know exactly how I calculated my math.
Okay, so maybe flip the sentences. I don't know, I mean, just, when I look at this, I kind of want to do some bold. I want to say maintain funding, maximize flexibility, increase transportation allocation, and then, authorize distribution, I mean, just to bold, just to do some, I mean, it's just because you have to kind of search for exactly what you're going for.
Make it stand, through the chair, to make it stand out more, I understand.
That is it for now, Mrs. Rourke, thank you.
Mrs. Berenborg?
Sure. I would like to make a comment about what was said. First of all, I agreed to do the legislative liaison because I was able to save us money. I went up there on my own, paid for everything on my own, didn't charge the district for any stay or transportation costs, did all of that work on my own time, didn't charge you one dime. So I think for your statement that you said, I'm a little offended by it. The other thing I will say is I am not a lobbyist, and I did my best to update this board. But we chose not to pay for a lobbyist at that time because we didn't have the funding. So I did what I could to help. So I'm sorry that that has somehow gotten in the way of your information. But my job was to step forward and try to help. It wasn't to get into the way. And if you feel like that has happened, I will absolutely step down from doing that, and then we'll have to put money into the account to pay for somebody else to go up there and do all those things, and that's fine. we can pay for a lobbyist. And I have learned a lot about what lobbyists do up in Tallahassee. There are groups that lobby for lots of different reasons, and there are lobbyists that are paid for by other school districts surrounding us. Sometimes that's not good. I'm going to tell you, I've learned that you can spend a lot of money and you can try to get something, but you can only do so much with helping to get what you need. And we are a smaller district, so we don't have the bite and the bark that some of the bigger districts have. So it does, I think, behoove us to work with other districts together to get possibly a lobbyist involved, to give us updates. And I was able to get some of that information from other groups that we belong to and other groups that I know of. So that helped me be able to get information. In no way is anything on here, anything that I have worked with the superintendent to get. The only thing that I asked for was in public record, which was for the funding to be redistributed so that we aren't in the position of going out for a tan anymore. I understand why the superintendent has put some of these things here, especially the hold harmless because of COVID. And I support that because I think it's important for every district to ask for that kids aren't held to a different standard because of COVID and what we've gone through. So I do support that part. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say, Mrs. Berenberg, I think you misunderstood me. In working with Representative Grull and Debbie Mayfield, a lot of times I work through their aides. And they're very busy people. And because your husband is an aide to Mrs. Grull, it has kept me from being able to communicate with him at times because of a fear of a violation of sunshine. And that was my concern. It had absolutely nothing to do with the quality of the work or your ability to do it or your willingness to do it. I think I've said before and I will say again, you did an enormous amount of work and it was wonderful for you to do that. So thank you for all of the work that you have done. It just was a note of my own personal advocacy for this district and a concern that I felt other board members should be aware of that had sometimes been a hindrance in my ability to communicate with our representatives.
So, board members, okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me just bring this a little closer so I can get myself comfortable. Dr. Moore, Mr. Fagan, Mr. Bass, I don't know which of you might have an answer to this, but with regard to virtual school, not related to COVID, just regular virtual school, how much does it cost us to run a virtual school program? Maybe Mr. Meyer as well. As related to FEFP funding, is it the same as a classroom? I know the answer in part, but for public purposes, is it the same as a regular classroom? I know Dr. Moore mentioned this a little bit last week, but can we just clarify what that cost is for us? Whomever.
Through the chair, I'll take the first step. So there is a little bit difference in the funding for a student that's full-time enrolled into the virtual program. I think Mr. Fagan can answer that more accurately than myself. But we did bring to the board a couple of what they call virtual instruction provider contracts, the VIP contracts back in the summer. We're required to have 3 options for the families. For each of those options, there is a little bit different pricing structure that the district is obligated to pay that provider to provide those services. It's not the entirety of the BSA that we get, the virtual BSA that we would get for the student, but it is the majority. So it does leave some funds, depending on the grade level in the program, for us to do other things to support the students, but the lion's share does go to those VIP providers to be the full-time provider of those services.
So how does that work in terms of funding for us? Thank you, Mr. Meyer.
To the chair. The FTE funding that you earn on a regular student versus a virtual child, for us, the district, approximately $7,900 per FTE is what we would earn for every child. If you're virtual, about $6,600. What they do not fund you on a virtual student is transportation and class size. So they take that out of the equation and give you the net difference. So that's what you would earn when we report that student to DOE. That's what they will fund us on.
So how, now let's add COVID to the mix. Now that we have the virtual program and the transitional program, how has that affected or changed running distant learning platforms for us?
To the chair, this differential right here only affects the children that are actually truly in the virtual program. It does not affect our transitional, and it does not affect the students that we label as virtual on our master course schedules.
So our transitional students are still considered
Full value.
full-time as if they were in the classroom, brick and mortar?
Through the chair, because of the innovation plan submitted to the state and the allowance provided from the state for the first semester, they're fully funding us for students through that innovation plan. So the answer to your question, to be very specific, is right now for our students who are in options 2 and 3, we are receiving full funding for the first FTE, which took place last month, or earlier this month, I'm sorry.
So wouldn't it benefit us moving forward to consider an option for adding virtual learning or distant learning to our legislative priorities? We're moving in that direction. We have to grow our virtual school program, board members. Where we were before COVID in terms of the virtual school here in the district, really there were very few students in the program, 40 in total. I mean, now we have 4,000. I mean, we literally jumped overnight, and I don't want to say blew up the system, you know, probably blew up Canvas and all these other platforms that, you know, and not just us, nationwide. Everybody has felt the impact of that. Considering what needs to be done for our virtual program, whether full-time virtual or whether we continue the transitional model, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work that has to be done to prepare teachers, to prepare students, to prepare the curriculum platform, to level the playing field and become competitive with other virtual standalone programs that offer ESE programs, that offer ELL classes, that offer classes for advanced students, you know, IB students, and so on and so forth. Many of those platforms are student-led, student-run, so the students go through modules, and then the teacher sort of is basically a facilitator. And then other virtual models, there is direct instruction for every single subject that a student is in. Either way, we're not there yet. We need to be there. And I think that in the 21st century, one of the priorities, one of the goals, Dr. Moore, when you came on, was to bring us to 21st century learning. That is part of a buy-in, I suppose, that in hiring you, it was something that we all agreed that we needed. And right now couldn't be any better time, in my opinion, that we look into and create something in our legislative platform and priorities that addresses this need. I would like to recommend to the, I'm sorry, Dr. Moore, please.
No, through the chair, I was just nodding my head in agreement. I think the state's funding system, very similar to other states, is based on seat time. And through COVID, we have had to reimagine what instruction looks like. And to say everything is just going to go back to normal would be selling our students and our communities short. So having the opportunity to not have to think around funding to create environments that maximize outcome for children is a very good thing to look at.
Board members, I would like to recommend, if you look at the suggestions that Dr. Moore had provided for us, the very last item on this page under educational innovation, it does talk about school choice programs. What is written, it states, provide supplemental supports and funding opportunities to assist districts in expanding school choice programs and the establishment of innovative learning spaces and virtual learning opportunities. I support that. That is indeed what we need. But school choice is very vast. School choice could be, technical college, which I have something else that I want to recommend for a technical college, for technical programs. It could also be the alternative school. It could be maybe the move towards our school choices that we're offering that just began last spring, where schools are creating options for parents to choose. Could be magnets. There's a lot of options there. We do not have here an item that specifically addresses virtual learning and distant learning here in our district. It is our responsibility, Mrs. Justice. I agree with you that it is the legislative priorities come from the board. I appreciate Dr. Moore bringing this to us. I do appreciate and I trust that he did not, pull his group together and say, okay, let's just list some of our priorities, that indeed many of these items, if not all, were gathered as a result of, all of our meetings. And everything that we mentioned throughout, he's taking notes and his team is bringing to him. I'm speaking on your behalf, Dr. Moore. I don't even know if this is true, but, the idea that you created this without our input, without our collective input, seems a bit of an overreach. But that's an assumption on my part, and maybe my assumption is an overreach. Still, I do believe that as a board, because it is our priority, because it is our responsibility to create these priorities, now is the time. So let's not waste any other time talking about how this list came about. Let's just start addressing what we want on there. I definitely would like to provide my input on the bottom. I'd like to keep that. I would, as I mentioned, with regard to virtual school, I don't know how to word it. I don't know if maybe a wording, for example, increase the general operating dollars or increase or ask for full funding, for continued full funding to support virtual school / distant learning / transitional model options. I don't know how you would word it, but that I think is something that needs to be on there. And to the extent that we would grow the program. I do not want to keep it where it is. I want us to be able to support teachers in professional development. I want us to be able to have funding available so that when we move into next year, we won't be limited in our options as to the 3 that Mr. Meyer just mentioned, but maybe we can expand those options, expand the course offerings, hire more teachers to be available for those one-on-one, distant learning opportunities. Okay, that's one, Madam Chair.
Speak to that?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I have a couple of others, so I don't know if you want to allow for questions on this particular item.
If you want to speak to that.
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think Mrs. Rosario brings up some great points, but I kind of take this as like the cake and then the icing on the cake, and if the cake inside is not stable, then you put icing on top and then the cake falls. And so I really think we need to focus on the cake right now. We've got kids being quarantined, and the cake being brick and mortar school. We've got kids being quarantined, and we have no learning mechanism for them when they're not in class. They're getting assignments off of Canvas. I brought up the cameras and and some other things to be able to do. It's my understanding we have more children being quarantined this week. So we're getting FTE and money for these students, and we're just sending them home. They're not being taught. They're not learning. I'm aware of more students that were quarantined back for a day or two and quarantined again from one of our high schools. So really, really concerned about that in this moment. So while I think that there is great advancement that can be made in virtual learning, and perhaps this is a piece of it, I don't know when this ends. We had meetings 2 weeks ago where we talked about halting mass quarantines or speaking with the health department. It seems that they still have authority as we see cases going up across the country. I do not know what happens with the emergency health the public health emergency mandate, declaration. So how can we work within this legislative platform now to encompass some of the things that you're saying, but really address some of the immediate needs that we have? Because this cycle of quarantining kids and out of school, I mean, it is just insanity. The kids are just falling behind left and right. And may I just, also, we are still dealing with a teacher shortage. And I see that it says support an innovative and meaningful approaches for the recruitment and retention of highly qualified teachers. So while increasing incentives to retain more experienced teachers, I wouldn't say more experienced, I would say veteran or in the district longer or something, but they're not necessarily more experienced than the teachers that we're hiring from elsewhere or bringing in from elsewhere, maybe, I don't know. And experience is kind of a subjective term sometimes. But we are still dealing with teacher issues at our schools. I know specifically in one of our middle schools, we are still dealing with not being able to fill the teaching positions we currently have. So, I've questioned the virtual that we created. I question the validity of doing that versus just using Florida Virtual for what it was at the time, because it does seem that we have been struggling. As we have more students returning to school, it seems that the programs in our brick and mortar schools are, from what I'm hearing, will be better supported because there is more staff there, so there will be more opportunity to meet the individual needs of each student in the schools. But I have a real concern about continuing to expand and not necessarily that there isn't a need, but doing what we do well. And so, Dr. Moore, if you could speak to that, because, I'm not saying that we're doing a bad job in our schools, but I think there is still room for improvement. And when I hear of students still not having teachers or dealing with substitutes and substitute issues, we haven't raised our sub pay. We haven't, I feel like we just have some things that we still need to address in the moment right now, and they're not new issues. Some of these issues are issues we've been struggling with for the past 4 years.
Before you speak, I really, I try to withhold my personal preferences on this platform because I don't think it is my place to create a legislative platform for a board. That's why I feel it strongly that this is the board's priorities. And feeling that way, knowing that I'm not going to be here to legislate for this, I really think that I would like to see this tabled and brought back when you do have the board members that are going to be here, that are going to be representing the priorities in going out and meeting with legislators, and it needs to be a collective. Yes, Mrs. Justice and I can give our input on this, but it's going to take the board working on it to make sure that these priorities get moved forward. And sometimes if you're not a part of creating something, you don't have that enthusiasm it's exactly to. And I want them to be a part of this process. And I feel like there's, we're almost there. One more meeting or 2 more meetings next month, and they can be a part of this. And I really feel like it's important for them to be here for this. Mrs. Rosario, then Mrs. Berenborg.
I don't disagree with what Mrs. Justice is saying, but I think that there are 2 different issues there. I think there's a concern about our practices and how we are managing what is currently happening in the schools versus what we want on our legislative platform. How do we want to word it on our priorities, I think is different than what is happening at the ground level in the schools and who we're quarantining. I don't believe that we're going to add something on our legislative platform about quarantining our students, who we're quarantining or not. But if we are quarantining students, our virtual program and our distant learning opportunities and options should be available for students who are quarantining. And as you agree with that, I think that would be something that still should be on here as a priority for us, to make sure that we are providing options for students. If it's 1 week then we need to have an option for a distant learning platform or a program or, something that will allow that child to do as much work with as high rigor as they would be if they were in the classroom. And right now, we're not established, we don't have that right now. We don't have the funding right now to do what we want to do with that. And I think
But we
that,
have $3 million in CARES Act money.
well, we have, he gave us a zero balance, Mr. Fagan gave us a zero balance budget of where that CARES money is. But I think that's a great conversation that we should have. Right now, we're talking about the legislative priorities. There's so many issues that I feel like we're losing momentum here. Can we just stick with what we're talking about so that we can move on? Let's offer as much input as we can about what we want here. I support tabling it, but we're here now. We can offer what we can now, continue the conversation with the new board members. But we're going in circles.
I
and
think that
this is
with-
the problem that
With
what
session
happens here.
starting, with session starting, COVID is going to be a big conversation, and money being appropriated for education is going to be a big conversation, and the fact that if every district was addressing some of the challenges that they're finding because of COVID in their legislative platform, including the fact we're not the only group that's having to quarantine students 2 weeks at a time, 2 weeks at a time, if we could show some of that data and say, please don't cut our funding, this is why we're trying to support quarantined students. This is, it doesn't currently exist, but I do think you might get some movement on something in session that is regarding this specific issue. And so it was just a thought for the district to kind of take a stand in the area of educational innovation on the legislative platform, because it's just for this session. It's not meant to, it's not a 5-year plan, it's this 1 year where you're going to be focusing on what you're asking for.
Well,
So
we
that
have-
was just a suggestion.
Yeah.
I see it as a need in my experience.
Mrs.
We have-
Barrenborg.
Thank you. I agree with you, Mrs. Zork. I think that we should table this, and I'll tell you why. Normally, in any other year, the legislatures would be starting earlier, but because it's an election year, it is starting later. So we do have a little bit of time. The other thing I will tell you is I have had conversations with some lobbyists that I know that work with education, and I've had some conversations with Andrea Messina about our legislative priorities and what they're doing and other districts are doing. And I've heard from all those people that we shouldn't ask for more. We should ask to stay the same or keep our priorities where they are right now, because there's not going to be a lot of money up there. And so we should hold fast on what we have and ask to keep it where it is. And stick with a few things. Don't go haywire with a bunch of asks, because I don't think we're going to see those. I think we need to concentrate on the asks that we need to keep in mind, that they are dealing with COVID and they're dealing with a budget crunch this year. So I agree with you that we can wait on this because legislators are starting later this year.
Dr. Schiff, my senior, had your.
I don't have a lot to add to the conversation. Most of it's been said, I don't need to reiterate. I do, though, want to acknowledge, I don't know a better word to say it, but the maturity of what you said, suggesting that the new board coming in should have their hands on this as the people who will own it going forward. And I appreciate that there's a tendency to want to leave an imprint. And I appreciate your acknowledgement that that may not be the thing to do at this moment, in light also of what Mrs. Barrenborg is suggesting, that the time frame is different this year because of the election and because of COVID. So I would support that. I would support perhaps having a general conversation, but really that the new board coming in are the people who will have to own this. And that and however that works, it is appropriate for them to have a voice in it.
So my suggestions are, right now, my suggestions from experience on this brings me back to something that Mrs. Barrenborg just said, that we really need to, even though we don't have a lobbyist, we pay quite a bit to be a part of the Florida School Board Association, and we're a part of the smaller coalition, Central Florida. And the reason that, makes those dollars, more feasible spending on that is because that brings you into more of a voice when you go to Tallahassee, because there is power in the numbers. And if we're creating a platform, yes, I do think that we have to have our own individual footprint on what we create, but I've been part of legislation to know that if you're the only little guy over here pushing for something, it's going to be very difficult. But if you could come along with Florida School Board Association or another coalition, and you can identify some of the same needs and really make that more of an impact, you're going to get those through before you're going to get these smaller things through, unless you have a legislator that specifically sits on the education committees and can push those things through. But I really think right now that I really think this needs to be tabled. I love legislative issues. I love working on those. That's what brought me to the board. We're working on issues like this. But I know that you have to have that fire within you, and you have to be you have to believe in what you're asking for it to really make an impact. And I just think that the 3 board members that are going to be here need to wait and allow to have those conversations with the other 2 that are going to be coming in just in a couple of weeks, and develop a plan together. And in the process, also get Florida School Board Association platform, and get some of the other coalitions and groups platforms, and look at where you guys can come together and make more of an impact together versus having individual priorities.
Sounds good. Shortest workshop we've ever had.
Do we have a consensus for that?
Agreed. Well put. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So, Mr. Superintendent, you're closing. I see that here?
I have no closing. Thank you.
Okay. All right. All right, so we're going to adjourn at 1:47.